The egg cracked at the worst possible moment. Not because of the noise, though the sound of ancient shell splitting open did echo through the entire hall of resonance like a struck bell. Not because of the light that spilled out, warm, amber, pulsing, filling a chamber that had been cold and dim for 300 years. It was the worst moment, because the 12 eldest Dracavari were in the middle of deciding the fate of an entire star system, and the hatching of one small egg that was not supposed to open for another 4 centuries interrupted them completely. Duras turned first. He was the oldest in the room by a wide margin, his scales the deep grey of cooling stone, his eyes the color of distant nebulae. He had lived long enough to watch stars die. He was not easily surprised, and yet. The hatchling that pushed her way out of the broken shell was no bigger than a river boulder. By Dracavari standards, she was tiny. Her scales were pale bronze, still soft, not yet hardened by the cold of space. Her wings were folded against her back and too large for her body, which gave her the look of something still figuring out how it was supposed to work. She blinked once. Then she looked around the chamber with enormous golden eyes that held far too much awareness for a creature that had been alive for approximately 4 minutes. One of the elders made a sound that was not quite a word. Another said very quietly that this was a terrible omen. Duras walked to her and crouched low. She looked up at him without fear. He studied her for a long moment and then said, in the oldest form of their language, that she was early. She blinked again. He said she was very, very early. She opened her small mouth, and instead of the ancient resonant sound that Dracavari young was supposed to make upon first waking, what came out was something that almost resembled the pattern structure of an external signal, a radio wave bent into sound. The chamber went completely silent. Duras looked at the broken egg, then at the hatchling. He told the council that the session was postponed. Several elders objected. He did not respond to that. He simply gathered the small bronze creature against his chest and carried her out. He named her Risa, which in the old tongue meant something between early and unexpected, and depending on how you inflected it, also meant fault line. She grew fast. Not in size, she remained smaller than most hatchlings, but in awareness. While young Dracavari typically spent their first decades in a state of slow, dreaming development, Risa was alert and restless from the start. She moved through the drift, the ancient hidden region of space that her kind called home, like something searching for a frequency she had not yet found. She pressed her senses outward past the edges of the drift and into the wider dark. She found signals there. Radio mostly, light-wave communication, the kind that only young civilizations used because they had not yet learned to fold transmission through space. They were faint by the time they reached her, scattered and slow, but she learned to gather them. She would sit for days at the edge of the drift's boundary fields and simply listen. Duras found her there often. He never told her to stop. He watched her with the particular expression of someone who does not yet understand something, but suspects it will matter later. Most of what she intercepted was noise, navigation data, trade records, military positioning signals from a dozen species she had no names for yet. She sorted through it the way one sorts through gravel looking for something that catches light. Then one cycle, she found the voice. It was small. It was coming from a system several light months away, a human colony world, she would later learn, though at the time she did not even have a word for human. The signal was damaged, looping on itself, repeating in fragments, but the voice inside it was clear enough. A child, young, even by the standards of a short-lived species. Leaving a message for someone named Father, explaining carefully that she was not scared, that she had been helping the other families collect water from the backup system, that the lights came on again for 2 hours yesterday and everyone was happy, that she hoped he was coming home soon, and that she kept his chair empty at dinner so there was room for him when he arrived. The message looped. The child said the same things again, then again. Risa stayed at the boundary for 11 consecutive days, listening to it. When she finally came back inside the drift, Duras was waiting. He asked where she had been. She told him about the signal, about the voice, about the child and the empty chair. Duras was quiet for a long time. Then he said that humans were a very young species, that they had only reached space a short while ago, that they were fragile and loud, and moved through the universe as though they had not yet understood how large it was. He did not say this unkindly. He said it the way one might describe a creature that has not yet grown into itself. Reiser asked if that meant they did not matter. Duras did not answer right away. He looked out past the boundary fields into the black where the signal had come from, and he said that in his experience, the question of who mattered was the most dangerous question in the universe. Then he told her to rest. She rested, but she kept the signal looping quietly in the back of her mind, the way you keep a fire small so it does not go out. 3 days later, the elders reconvened. A coalition of 7 species had filed a formal extermination order against humanity. The vote, Duras reported to her that evening, had already passed. Reiser said nothing. She just pressed the child's voice a little closer to the part of herself that knew things before she understood them. There is a place inside a hollowed neutron star shell where the Dracovari keep their oldest records. It has no proper name because names imply that things can be found, and this place is not meant to be found easily. The walls hold memory the way stone holds heat, slowly, deeply, and for far longer than seems possible. It is called the Hall of Silence, and the silence is not peaceful. It is the kind of silence that comes from knowing too much. Duras brought Reiser there the morning after the council's announcement. He did not explain why until they were inside, standing before the long curved walls where the memory coils ran in spirals from floor to ceiling. Each coil held the recorded history of a civilization the Dracovari had observed. Some coils were thick with information. Others were short, ending abruptly, which was its own kind of record. He told her that the coalition calling itself the Kethvari had grown powerful over the last 2,000 years. 7 species with different reasons for wanting the same thing, a galaxy where nothing unpredictable was allowed to take root. Humanity, he said, had been unpredictable from their very first moment in space. They had arrived without invitation, moved without asking, made contact with species they had no diplomatic framework for approaching, and somehow survived every encounter that should have ended them. The Kethvari had been watching for a long time. Now they had decided that watching was enough. Reiser asked how long humanity had. Duras said the fleet was already assembling, weeks, perhaps less. She walked along the wall and looked at the coils. She asked, without turning around, if any of them were human. He said not yet. She did not ask what would have to happen for one to exist. She already knew. Then she did something Duras had not expected. She asked him to show her the records of every civilization that the Dracovari had watched fall. He was quiet. She said she wanted to understand. He said that some things were better understood from a distance. She said she had already heard a child's voice on a looping signal for 11 days and that she no longer had the luxury of distance. He granted her access. She spent the rest of that day and all of the night inside the Hall of Silence reading. Duras sat outside and waited, because he had lived long enough to know that some things cannot be interrupted once they begin. What Reiser found in the records was not what she had expected. She had thought she would find evidence of species that deserved to fall, civilizations that were cruel or reckless or built on destruction. Some were, but many were not. Many were simply young. They had made mistakes that older species had also made. Only the older species had been given time to correct them. The younger ones had not. The pattern in the records was very clear once you knew to look for it. The species that were allowed to survive long enough to become something better were the ones that someone had decided were worth the patience. The ones who fell were the ones that no one had been willing to wait for. She also found something else. In nearly every case where a Dracovari elder had observed a civilization approaching destruction, there was a dissenting record, a note, a formal objection, a single voice arguing that the non-interference rule should be set aside. In every case, the elder who argued for intervention had been overruled by the majority. In every case, the civilization in question had ended. The majority was always the oldest. The oldest were always the most certain. Reiser came out of the Hall of Silence when the light inside the drift had shifted to its pale morning cycle. Her eyes were different, not sadder exactly, more settled, the way something looks when it has stopped being surprised and started being decided. Duras was still there. He had not moved. She sat beside him and told him what she had found. He said he knew what the records contained. He had put most of them there himself. She asked why, if he knew. He had never argued for intervention. He said that he had argued twice early in his life and been overruled both times, and that he had eventually understood that there were things the Dracavari were not meant to alter. She asked him who decided what the Dracavari were meant for. He said that was a very dangerous question. She said she seemed to be collecting those. Then the formal announcement reached them. A pulse through the drift, ancient protocol, calling all elders and any witnesses to the Hall of Resonance. The triath had been declared. Risa looked at Duras. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not quite worry, more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something and knowing the edge is real. He explained it to her carefully. The triath was an ancient law, older than most of the current elders. It was triggered when a Dracavari made first contact, even accidental contact, with a species currently under coalition death order. Risa had not made contact yet, but the council had reviewed her boundary sessions, her 11 days of listening, and ruled that extended intentional observation of a targeted species constituted a form of witness contact under the old law. The law required that the witness be given a choice, 3 choices specifically, and that the choice, once spoken aloud in the triath chamber, could not be taken back. Risa asked if she would be allowed to choose. Duras said the law required it regardless of age. He said it in a tone that made clear he had already tried to find a way around this and had not succeeded. She stood up. She brushed dust from her small bronze scales. She told him she needed one night to think. He said she could have it. She went back to the boundary field alone and sat in the dark for a long time with a child's voice looping quietly in the back of her mind. She did not sleep. She thought about empty chairs and short coils of memory and the particular silence of a hall full of things that ended before they were finished. By morning, she knew what she was going to say. The Hall of Resonance was full in a way it had not been in living memory. That phrase meant something different for the Dracavari than it did for other species. Living memory, for an elder of the drift, could stretch back 30,000 years. So when it was said that the hall had not been this full in living memory, it meant that every Dracavari who still existed in any form had gathered here, and the hall vibrated with the low frequency that their combined presence made, a sound below sound, felt in the chest rather than heard by the ears. Risa stood at the center. She was small. Even as a hatchling she had known she was small by Dracavari standards, but standing in the middle of that gathering, surrounded by elders whose wingspans stretched wider than some moons, she understood smallness in a new way. The Ancient Ones sat in the curved tiers above her like geological formations, slow-moving, monumental, deeply patient. Their eyes caught the chamber light and held it. Several of them had lived long enough that the scales along their spines had begun to crystallize, turning translucent at the tips. Duras was positioned at the first tier. He did not look at her directly. He was looking at the far wall with the particular stillness of someone who has already had the argument they needed to have inside their own mind and has arrived at the other side of it. The eldest of the council, a massive creature named by the others only as the Old One, because even the Dracavari sometimes run out of useful words, spoke the 3 choices aloud in the ancient tongue. The language was so old that hearing it felt less like listening and more like being pressed on from all sides. The words hung in the chamber air and stayed. The first choice was withdrawal. Leave the human system, return to the drift, record the event and let it pass. This was the option built into the law for exactly this kind of situation, a young Dracavari who stumbled into a witness position before she was old enough to carry the weight of decision. The elders expected it. Several had already privately agreed that it was the only reasonable outcome. The second choice was termination of the conflict's source. Both the coalition and the targeted species were threats at different scales. Remove both. Silence the instability. This option had been chosen twice in recorded history and both times the aftermath had been catastrophic, not because the removal itself was wrong, but because the galaxy had reacted to the removal in ways that caused longer and more complicated suffering. It was not a real option. It was included because the law required it be spoken. Third choice was intervention. Place the Drakavari name formally between the coalition and humanity, not with weapons, not with destruction, with presence, with the weight of what the Drakavari were to every other species in the known galaxy, which was something between myth and warning. No dragon had ever exercised this choice. There was no precedent. There was no protocol. The law included it because the lawmaker had believed, a very long time ago, that someone ought to at least be allowed to try. The Old One finished speaking. The chamber waited. Risa took a breath. It was a small breath. She was a small creature, but the chamber was built for resonance, and even small sounds carried here. She spoke the third choice. The word for it in the old tongue was long and layered, carrying inside it all the meanings the lawmaker had packed into it: protection, witness, claim, and something that translated closest to "I will stand here." Risa said all of it clearly, without hesitation, without the stumble that came from uncertainty. She had spent the night making sure there would be no stumble. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that outside observers might have expected. There was no explosion of light, no physical earthquake. What happened was that the resonance in the chamber changed pitch. Every Drakavari present felt it simultaneously, the frequency of a spoken triath lock, the ancient signal that meant a choice had been made and the law had heard it. It was not possible to unspeak a locked triath. It was not possible to pretend it had not happened. Three elders spoke immediately and at volume. They argued that the law required a minimum age, that a hatchling could not be held to a triath claim, that the word itself was invalid without the weight of a mature Drakavari behind it. The Old One said quietly that the law did not specify age, only witness status, and the council had itself ruled on her witness status the day before. If they wished to overturn that ruling, they were welcome to begin proceedings, which would take approximately 200 years, and during which time the coalition fleet would complete its work. The three elders went quiet. Duras finally looked at her. She could not read his expression exactly. It was something large and complicated that she did not yet have the experience to fully translate. The Old One addressed her directly then. Its voice was slow and enormous. It said that the consequence of a failed third-choice triath had always been the same. If the intervention produced worse outcomes than the original event would have, the witness who claimed the choice was bound to observe the full result without interference and to carry the record of it alone. It asked if she understood. She said she understood. It said that if humanity proved to be everything the coalition claimed, she would report that finding and the matter would be closed in the coalition's favor. She said she understood that too. It said that she was very young to carry something like this. She said that the humans she had listened to were very young too, and they seemed to be managing. No one in the chamber said anything for a moment. The Old One made a sound that, if you had spent any time around extremely old and very serious creatures, you might have recognized as the closest such a being ever comes to a surprised laugh. Then it formally closed the triath session and dismissed the gathering. Duras came to her after. He stood beside her in the emptying hall and did not say anything immediately. She waited. Eventually he said that she had created a problem that would outlast both of them. She said she thought that was probably true. He said he was not sure if that was a good thing. She said she was not sure either, but she was going to find out. He put one large grey wing briefly over her small bronze back. It lasted only a moment. Then he pulled it away and told her she had better figure out how to reach the humans before the coalition fleet did. She was already working on that. Oren had fixed the same antenna array 4 times in 2 weeks, which he felt was a reasonable metric for how the posting was going overall. Relay Station Caro sat at the edge of neutral space like a forgotten comma in a very long sentence. It was not a glamorous assignment. It was not even a particularly interesting one. Its job was to receive signals, forward signals, and not fall apart in the process. The last part was proving ambitious. Oren was the station's only engineer, which the posting description had called a unique opportunity for independent problem-solving, and which Oren had come to understand meant that when something broke, nobody was coming. He was halfway up the antenna scaffolding with a welding tool in one hand and a ration bar in his other when the shadow appeared. He did not notice it immediately because shadows did not typically appear in open space, which was part of why it took him longer than it should have to process what was happening. The station's solar panels dimmed first. Then the ambient light outside the viewport shifted. Then the scaffolding sensors started chirping unhappily about unexpected mass readings, which was the point at which Oren looked up. He was a man who prided himself on remaining calm in difficult situations. He had handled equipment failures, communication blackouts, a small structural breach in Sector 4 that he had patched with emergency foam, and briefly, his own jacket. He was not easily rattled. He stayed very still on the scaffolding for approximately 30 seconds. Then he climbed down, walked to the main console with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided that moving slowly will make reality more manageable, and pulled up the external sensor array. The readings made no sense. He ran the diagnostic twice. The readings continued to make no sense. He looked out the main viewport. A dragon was looking back at him. He registered several things in rapid order. First, that it was clearly alive. Second, that it was clearly enormous, though perhaps smaller than the word dragon implied, maybe twice the length of the station, which was still extremely large. Third, that its scales were bronze-colored and caught the starlight in a way that was genuinely beautiful, which struck him as an inappropriate thing to notice, but he noticed it anyway. Fourth, that it was looking at him specifically, not at the station in general, but at the viewport where he was standing, with golden eyes that held a quality he could only describe as attention. He opened the communications channel. He was not entirely sure why. It seemed like the thing to do. He said hello. There was a pause. Then a voice came back through the channel that was not transmitted the way signals normally were. It was closer to the station's hull resonating, the sound conducted through structure rather than transmitted through antenna. It said hello in return. The word was clear. The accent was unlike anything he had encountered in 10 years of relay work, but the word was perfect. He asked what it was. It said it was Drakavari. He had heard the word exactly once, in a deep history lecture during his basic galactic orientation, in the context of things that technically existed but that no living human had ever encountered, and that most xenobiologists privately considered to be mythological. He had not taken notes on that section. He sat down on the floor next to the console. He was not sure when he had decided to sit on the floor, but it seemed correct. The creature Risa, she told him her name was Risa, spoke to him for the next hour. She did not ease into it. She explained the coalition, the fleet, the death order, the timeline. She explained it the way someone explains something when they are aware that time is short and that softening the information will not make it more survivable. He listened. He asked clarifying questions 3 times. She answered them. He asked her to repeat the fleet size. She did. He asked if she was certain. She said she was. He sat with that for a moment. Then he asked the question that he knew was probably not the most important question tactically, but was the one he needed answered anyway. He asked why she cared. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about a signal, a child's voice on a damaged loop, coming from a colony world, talking about an empty chair saved at the dinner table. She described it plainly, without performance. She said she had listened to it for 11 days and that it had made her understand something she did not have a word for yet in any language she knew. Oren looked out the viewport at her large golden eyes. He thought about the kind of thing that would make an ancient and powerful creature choose to listen to a broken signal for 11 days, and then cross the galaxy to argue on behalf of the signal's species in front of its own elders. He said, okay. She asked what okay meant in this context. He said it meant he believed her. It meant he was going to help. It meant that being afraid of her was probably the reasonable response, but that being reasonable had never gotten the station's antenna array fixed, so he was going to work with what he had. She asked what she needed from him. He said she needed a human voice to take her message to the High Council, someone who could confirm contact had been made, that the Dracovari were real, that the threat was real. If she showed up at the council directly, it would take weeks to get past the panic. He could send a priority signal that would be read in hours. She said that was a reasonable plan. He said most of his plans were reasonable, they just never looked like it from the outside. He spent the next 2 hours composing the most important message of his career, trying to convey in official language that a dragon was outside his station, and that the galaxy was 3 weeks from ending, and that he was reasonably confident the dragon was on their side. He sent it marked Priority Absolute, which was a designation he had never used before and which he was fairly sure required a supervisor's authorization he did not have. He decided that was a problem for later. Outside the viewport, Risa was still watching, patient in the way that something is patient when it has already chosen its direction and is simply waiting for the world to catch up with that choice. He waved at her, he was not sure why. She dipped her head slightly, which he chose to interpret as a wave back. The Kethvari fleet was the largest single military formation assembled in the current galactic era. That was not a boast. It was simply a fact that Admiral Sova kept in mind the way one keeps a structural column in mind, not constantly, but with an awareness that it was there and that the rest of the architecture depended on it. 3,042 warships sat in formation at the edge of the human exclusion zone. The formation was not tight. It did not need to be. Against anything humanity could currently deploy, tightness was an aesthetic choice rather than a tactical one. Sova was reviewing perimeter scan data when the alert came through. An unknown vessel had been detected at the outer edge of the exclusion zone. Not human, the signature was nothing like human technology, not any known coalition pattern either. The scan officer read out the mass estimate and then went quiet for a moment and read it out again, as though the second reading might produce a more comfortable number. It did not. Sova told the fleet to hold position. Nobody moved. A Kethvari fleet did not survive this long by confusing uncertainty with weakness. You held, you gathered information, then you acted. She opened a scan of the object herself. The mass estimate was large. The heat signature was biological. The profile matched nothing in their database, which was thorough enough to cause concern. She was working through possible explanations when the object moved, not like a vessel with engines, but like a living thing choosing to reposition, and presented itself broadside to the fleet's forward sensors. Her scan officer said, very quietly, that it appeared to be a dragon. The bridge crew, to their credit, did not panic. They had been selected for exactly this kind of moment. Several of them went very still, which is a different thing from panic and arguably more disciplined. Sova said she wanted a full species identification. The result came back in 40 seconds. Dracovari. The scan officer's voice had changed by the time she read out the word. There was a new quality in it, not fear exactly. The particular quality of someone who has just opened a door they expected to lead to a cupboard and found instead that it led outside. The broadband channel opened on its own. The signal came through the hull, bone deep, and when the voice arrived it was calm and clear and spoke in standard galactic trade language without preamble. It said, "My name is Risa. I am Dracovari. The species you are moving against is under Dracovari observation. I am formally notifying this fleet that any action taken against the human worlds is an action that intersects Dracovari interest." Sova listened. She listened to the whole thing twice, then she opened the response channel. She said she was Admiral Sova, commanding officer of the Kethvari Forward Fleet, and that she required clarification. Dracovari observation of a species was not the same as Dracovari protection. The distinction mattered under galactic law. She asked the creature to confirm whether it was claiming formal protection status or observation status, because one of those had legal weight in coalition space and one of them did not. There was a pause. Sova recognized the pause. She had been in negotiations long enough to know what it meant when the other party needed a moment they had not planned for. Risa said that the specifics of the status were a matter of current internal determination, and that she was not in a position to make a full declaration without elder endorsement. Sova said that was what she had thought. She said it respectfully, but she said it. Another pause, longer this time. Then a second frequency opened on the channel. This one felt different, older, the kind of old that does not arrive through technology, but through something the technology is merely carrying. A voice spoke in a language that was not trade standard and not anything in Sova's translation archive. It was 6 words long. The ambient temperature on the bridge dropped 2 degrees, which later analysis would attribute to a collective physiological stress response in the crew and not to anything the signal itself did, though 3 officers filed incident reports anyway. Sova's translation AI worked on the 6 words for 11 seconds, which was 8 seconds longer than it typically needed for anything. When it produced a result, the result read, "She speaks for us." Sova sat with that for a moment. On the display in front of her, the small bronze creature outside held position between her fleet and human space. It had not moved. It had not threatened. It had simply placed itself there, in the gap, and brought with it the weight of a species that the galaxy had feared for longer than the Kethvari had existed. She thought about what it meant to fire on something under Dracavari claim. Not practically. She understood the practical consequences well enough. She thought about what it would mean in the record, what it would mean to be the fleet that had broken the one rule every spacefaring species agreed on without anyone ever formally writing it down. You did not antagonize the Dracavari, not because they would necessarily respond, but because you could never be certain they would not. She ordered a tactical pause. Her second-in-command asked how long. She said indefinitely pending review and that a formal reclassification request would be submitted through council channels. Her second-in-command understood what that meant. Coalition council reviews on reclassification took years, sometimes centuries. The fleet would not hold position for centuries, but the order to advance would not come today. It would not come next week. By the time the bureaucracy finished grinding through the question of whether Dracavari observation constituted sufficient cause for restraint, the political landscape would have shifted in ways that no one in this fleet could currently predict. She closed the channel. On the external monitor, Risa remained in the gap between the fleet and human space. Still, patient, holding the line with nothing but her name and 6 borrowed words from someone far older than anyone in this fleet. Sova pulled up the tactical map and looked at the human worlds on the far side of the exclusion zone. 43 colony systems, population count in the billions, short-lived, unpredictable, not yet anything they might someday become. She thought about the fact that a creature who had apparently been alive for a very short time, by any measure she could apply to the word, had flown to the edge of a 3,000-ship fleet and told it to stop. And the fleet had stopped. She filed the formal review request. She made no note of what she personally thought about the outcome. Admirals did not put that in reports, but she closed the file and held one thought as she returned to the routine work of standing down a fleet that no longer had an immediate objective. The dragon was very small, and she had not flinched once. The colony world of Vesper's landing smelled like wet soil and something sweet that Risa did not have a name for. She landed at the edge of the settlement, far enough back that her wings did not flatten the fence line, and folded herself as small as she could manage, which was still not very small. The grass in a wide circle around her pressed flat against the ground, as though deciding that proximity to her required a certain posture. She waited. It had been 1 year. In Dracavari terms, 1 year was less than the time it took to draw a deep breath and release it. In human terms, apparently, it was enough time for the story of what had happened to reach every inhabited system, get told and retold, gain and lose details, become larger and smaller depending on who was telling it and why, and produce a complicated global conversation about what humanity should do now. Oren had summarized this for her during one of their regular relay conversations. He had described the global conversation as loud and confusing and going in 17 directions at once, which she had gathered was normal for humanity and therefore probably fine. The door to the nearest building opened. A woman stepped out, looked at Risa, and went back inside. Risa waited. This was also normal. She had been visiting human settlements for 3 months now, in her formal new role as the Drakavari's first liaison to humanity, a title the Elder Council had given her with the energy of people resolving a situation rather than celebrating an outcome. And she had learned that the initial response was almost always a door opening and closing while whoever was inside decided what they were doing. Then a child came out. She was perhaps 12 years old. She had dark eyes and mud on her boots, and she walked across the field toward Risa with the particular directness of someone who had already had the internal argument about being afraid and resolved it before she left the building. She stopped about 4 meters away. She looked up at Risa. She said, "I heard you heard my message." Risa lowered her head until it was close to the child's level. The movement was slow and deliberate, the way she had learned to move around humans slowly, with her intentions visible in advance. She looked at Nira directly. She said, "I did. It was the most important thing I ever heard." Nira considered this. She asked which part. Risa said the part about the chair. Nira nodded as though this was the correct answer. She said her father had come back. He had been delayed by a communications failure in the outer belt, but he had come back. She said she wanted Risa to know that because she thought maybe the reason Risa had listened was connected to the not knowing, and she wanted to close that loop. It seemed important. Risa was quiet for a moment. She had spent a great deal of the last year among humans, and she was still sometimes surprised by the way they thought, the care they put into small closures, the instinct to complete the circle of a thing rather than leave it open. It was, she had decided, one of their most significant qualities. Not strength, not intelligence, not even the improbable survival instinct that had carried them this far into a galaxy that had not been designed with them in mind. It was the way they tended to things, the way they went back and finished what they had started. She told Nira she was glad he had come back. Nira said she was glad too. Then she asked if Risa wanted to stay for dinner. Risa said she was not sure she could fit in the building. Nira looked at the building, then at Risa, and said that was probably true, but that she could eat outside and they could eat on the steps, and it was basically the same thing. Risa said that sounded acceptable. Oren arrived 2 hours later in a shuttle, carrying what he had described in his message as supplies, and which turned out to be one very large container of coffee, 3 types of something he called snacks, and a portable heater that he said was for him, but that Risa suspected was, because he found open space cold in a way he did not like to admit. He set up on the steps while Nira's family brought out plates, and the settlement's other residents filtered out in 2s and 3s, keeping a respectful distance but not leaving either. He handed her a cup of something he poured from a second container. She had finally tried coffee 2 weeks prior and had thoughts about it that she had not fully sorted yet. This was different, warmer. He said it was called tea, and that he had figured after all the philosophical conversations they had about the nature of civilization and sacrifice, she deserved something that did not taste like burnt ambition. She found this very funny. She was learning to find Oren very funny on a fairly regular basis. They sat while the sun went down over Vesper's Landing, a slow orange collapse behind a distant ridge. Nira had fallen asleep on the steps between them, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought out. The settlement lights came on one by one, small and warm against the dark. Oren asked if she would do it again, all of it. The chamber, the fleet, the bluff with the 6 borrowed words. She thought about it honestly. She thought about the Hall of Silence and the short coils of memory and the elders who had always been overruled. She thought about Dura's saying she speaks for us in a voice that had changed something in the architecture of the galaxy, quietly, the way a single stone changes the direction of a stream. She said, every time. He nodded, he drank his coffee. He looked out at the stars coming through as the sky darkened and said that most of humanity still did not fully understand what she had given up or risked to do what she did. She said she had not given up anything. She had chosen. He said sometimes those were the same thing. She said sometimes they were not, and that the difference was worth paying attention to. He said that was probably the most dragon thing she had ever said. She said she was working on it. The settlement was quiet now. Neera breathed slowly on the steps. The stars were very bright this far from the system's center, and Risa knew the shapes of them the way she knew the shapes of everything she had spent long hours watching, not just as light but as distance, as time, as the particular patience of things that would still be burning long after every argument about them had ended. She had three choices once. She had spoken one word in an old chamber, and the word had held. The galaxy had not ended, the chair had been filled, the small things were still turning. She decided that was enough. For now, it was more than enough.